Delighted to be here, my fellow citizens, ladies and gentlemen. And take note that I say ladies, because the Progressive Party is the only presidential election party of 1912 that will fight for and demand a constitutional amendment granting women the right to vote. How can any society in good conscience grant that gemstone of American democracy the right and moral obligation to vote to an illiterate street sweeper because he's a man, then deny that gemstone to a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, or a nurse simply because she's a woman? Therefore, if you ladies will persuade your husbands, your fathers, your brothers, and your sons to vote for me in 1912, in 1916, you'll be able to go to the ballot box and vote for the candidate of your choice. Now, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce myself to you for the benefit of those who have been misinformed by the lies printed about me by William Randolph Hearst in his newspaper, the New York Journal. At my home, named Sagamore Hill in Oyster Bay, New York, we received the New York Journal, but only because my 17-year-old son, Archibald, has a pet parrot named Buster. And Buster takes particular delight in adding his comments to the editorial pages of the New York Journal, which we use to line the bottom of his cage, particularly after he's had a large lunch of peanuts. Now, first of all, the name is Theodore, not Teddy. Only one person in my life ever had my permission to call me by that nickname, and when she died at the tender age of 22, that permission was never extended to another living soul. No one in my family or my close circle of friends would dare call me Teddy. But the newspapers will not call me anything else because they know it irritates me so. The last name is Roosevelt. Not Roosevelt, not Roosevelt, but Roosevelt. When my ancestor, Klaas van Roosevelt, came over from Holland in the late 1600s, the family changed the pronunciation and the spelling to the current Roosevelt during the War of Independence. All branches of the family subscribe to that pronunciation and that spelling. And now, with your permission, I would like to introduce my family to you by proxy. My father, Theodore Roosevelt, Sr. A successful New York City businessman, philanthropist, founder of the American Museum of Natural History, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the New York Orthopedic Hospital. He was the greatest man I ever knew in my life, and his nickname was Great Heart. My mother, Martha Bullock Roosevelt, a Southern belle raised upon a slave-owning Georgia plantation who once declared that the Civil War was not officially over until she surrendered, and she never did. One New York newspaper once described her as the most beautiful woman in New York City. My younger brother, Elliot Roosevelt. Considered by the family the most intellectually gifted, most athletically capable, and voted most likely to succeed. However, in later years, his sole claim to fame would be that he was the father of Eleanor Roosevelt. My younger sister, Corinne Roosevelt. My younger sister and lifelong friend. The best thing that she did, I left that one. My older sister, Anna Roosevelt. In between there. my older sister and lifelong best friend. When I became a widower, she agreed to raise my little daughter, Alice, as if she were her very own. And my younger sister, Corinne, would grow up to be a talented author and later grandmother to those famed journalists, Joseph and Stuart Alsop. But the best thing that my younger sister, Coney, did for me was to introduce me to her playmate, Edith Kermit Carew. Now, Edith Kermit Carew was not a member of the Roosevelt family, but she was in all of the family portraits because she was inseparable from my younger sister, Coney. And as of last December, Edith and I have been husband and wife for 25 years. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Roosevelt family by proxy. I was born on October 27th, 1858 in New York City. As a child, I was severely afflicted by asthma. So severely, I had to sleep sitting up in a chair or propped up in my bed with 4 pillows behind my back. Many a night I had not sufficient breath to blow out the bedside candle. The family physician predicted that I would not live to reach my 7th birthday. Because I was a semi-invalid, I was homeschooled by my Aunt Anna, my mother's sister, who gave me the basics of education by teaching me reading, writing, and that third discipline I could never quite get my arms around. But reading opened a whole new world to me. My father had a modest library, and while my neighborhood chums were amusing themselves by rolling hoops down 20th Street, I was in my father's library, sailing around the Horn with Magellan, exploring the Western rivers with Lewis and Clark, and conquering Persia with Alexander the Great. One book that I found particularly fascinating was a book on taxidermy. I read it from cover to cover twice, and I mastered the art and the skills. When my neighborhood chums would try to impress their neighborhood sweethearts by presenting them with a bouquet of flowers, I would win the day by reaching into my pocket and pulling out a perfectly preserved dead bat. One day, after a particularly bad bout of asthma, my father, Greatheart, took me aside and told me, "Teedy," which was my nickname growing up, "a man needs 3 things in this world to succeed: decisive judgment, bold action, and courage of perseverance. Your intellect will give you decisive judgment. Your body must give you bold action. Together, they will give you courage of perseverance. You must build your body." I raised my hand and I swore to him, "I will, Father. I will build my body." I started a regimen of running 25 miles every day, rain or shine, summer or winter, or rowing 25 miles in the East River in my one-man rowboat. An upstairs bedroom was transformed into my private gymnasium, outfitted with barbells, Indian clubs, a chin-up bar, and a punching bag. My father even hired a professional prize fighter to teach me the manly art of pugilistics. In 1876, when the United States Army was proving its ineptitude at fighting Indians by the debacle of Little Bighorn and General George Armstrong Custer, I was proving my aptitude for higher education by passing the entrance examinations to Harvard College. I started Harvard that fall, and back then I was known as that skinny New York City kid, for I only weighed 124 pounds when I started college, who ran to all of his classes, who excelled in foreign languages, history, science, and was captain of the rowing team and the boxing team. During my summers off, I would go with a classmate whose father owned a timber camp in northern Maine. I would become a lumberjack for the summer. I learned to use a double-bitted axe, a 2-man crosscut saw. And on my days off, I would climb every high mountain within a 20-mile radius of the camp. In 1878, while I was attending Harvard, a Western Union messenger appeared at my classroom door. It was a telegram from my younger brother Elliot. It said, "T.D., come home at once. Greatheart is dying." I excused myself from the classroom. I ran from Cambridge down to the train depot in Boston. I caught my first train to New York City. I ran down the street to my home to be met at the front door by my younger brother Elliot, who said, "Greatheart is gone." He was 46 years old. I attended his funeral on February 12th, Abraham Lincoln's birthday. Curious about that date. You see, when I was a child of 6, Edith Kermit Carew and I watched from my uncle's upstairs apartment window as the casket of recently slain Abraham Lincoln was paraded down Fifth Avenue on its way to interment at Springfield, Illinois. And ever since that day, I've always associated the name of Lincoln and his birthday, February 12th, with death. And now, my father was being buried on February 12th. I raised my hand. I swore I will make my father's name, Theodore Roosevelt, known throughout the world. I went back to Harvard. Then during the winter of 1879, 1880, I was invited by a classmate, Dick Saltonstall, to visit his family mansion north of Boston overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. There, I met his next-door neighbor. Her name was Alice Hathaway Lee, the most strikingly beautiful young lady I had ever seen in my life. She did not realize it, but I made an entry in my journal that very evening that someday she shall be Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt. Decisive judgment. I posed the question, "Will you marry me?" She said no. Courage of perseverance. 1 month later, I posed the question again, "Will you please marry me?" She said no. Bold action. I purchased an engagement ring at a jewelry store. I rented a rig pulled by a handsome pony. I took her to an orchestra concert in Boston. And on our way home, I jumped down out of the rig, got down on one knee and said, "Miss Lee, say that you'll make me the proudest man in America by becoming Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt." She said yes. She said we can announce our engagement on February 12th. I said, no, let us delay it for 2 days and announce it on February 14th, St. Valentine's Day. That would be much more romantic. That is what we did. Ladies and gentlemen, Alice Hathaway Lee. As graduation was approaching in 1880, I went back to the family physician, the same one who predicted that I would not live to reach my 7th birthday, for a checkup. He said, "Mr. Roosevelt, all of those years of asthma have affected your heart and your lungs. When you graduate from Harvard, you must pursue a career that has no physical activity associated with it whatsoever. Any strenuous physical activity on your part would be instantly fatal." I made up my mind to completely disregard what my doctor had advised. I kept up with my running, my rowing, and in my senior year, I was the runner-up boxing champion of Harvard College. I graduated magna cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, number 26 out of a class of 137. I might have graduated first had it not been for calculus and trigonometry. Following graduation, Alice and I were married on my 22nd birthday, October 27th, 1880. Why, you might ask, would a gentleman schedule his wedding on his birthday? It was that mathematics thing. I thought it might be the only way that I'd be able to remember my anniversary. After a short 12-week honeymoon in Europe, where I climbed the Matterhorn, Alice and I were sailing back to America when she turned to me and said, "Teddy, the only person in my life given my permission to call me by that nickname, what do you plan to do with the rest of your life?" I said, "I am going to be a lawyer. I've enrolled in Columbia Law School." But it soon became apparent to myself, my classmates, and my professors that I would never become a lawyer. I remember standing up in class one day and arguing against the injustice of precedent law when my professor said, "Mr. Roosevelt, would you prefer that I left the classroom so that you may teach this course of instruction without my constant interruption?" I terminated my law school career at the end of the next week, and simultaneously I was asked by the Republican Party of New York State if I'd be a willing candidate to run for the state assembly. I said, "Bully!" I campaigned from east to west, from north to south in my district, and mostly upon my father's good name, and with the financial help of my father's friends, I was elected the youngest assemblyman in the state of New York. I strolled into the Capitol building in Albany. Heads turned. They said, "Who is that young dude? A new page?" They said, "No, that is the young Theodore Roosevelt. He is the youngest assemblyman in the state of New York." The problem with being the youngest assemblyman is, in order to introduce a bill, you must be recognized by the Speaker of the Assembly. It was the same Speaker who was Speaker when I was born. I would raise my hand and say, "Mr. Speaker." "Mr. Speaker." "Mr. Speaker!" For 40 minutes if necessary, until I was recognized. I would introduce my bill, and by the end of my first term, I had introduced and passed more bills than any other member of the Assembly, regardless of their age or seniority. After election to my second term in the Assembly, I was arguing a bill when a Western Union messenger appeared at the door. It was a telegram from my older sister, Anna. It said, "Teddy, congratulations. Your wife, Alice, has delivered a beautiful baby girl named Alice Lee Roosevelt on February 12th, 1884. I thanked the young man. I continued to argue my bill, and within the hour, a second messenger appeared with a second telegram from my sister. This time it said, "Teddy, come home at once. Mother is dying, and so is your wife." I excused myself from the assembly. I ran down to the train depot. I caught the last train from New York City. When I arrived in New York City, the city was enshrouded in a thick fog. I ran from gas lamp to gas lamp along the street until I arrived at my home, to be met at the front door by my older sister, Anna, who said, "Mother has been diagnosed with typhoid fever, and the doctor says she will not live through the night. And your wife, Alice, has been diagnosed with Bright's disease, a disease of the kidneys, which was masked by her pregnancy. She is upstairs in your bedroom in a coma." I bounded up the stairs. I held my wife's hand. I spoke to her. She did not realize I was even in the room. I tried to comfort her. I spoke to her. I whispered to her. I brushed her hair till my sister Bammy, Anna, knocked on the door, said, "Titi, if you're going to say goodbye to Mother, you must do it now." I went down the main stairway into the master bedroom where I held my mother's limp, cool hand until the flame from her candle of life flickered and grew dark. She was 48 years old. I went back upstairs to comfort my wife, and 13 hours later, in that same house, on that same day, my 22-year-old wife's flame flickered and grew dark, shutting out all the light from my soul. Both of the women I loved so dearly, gone in the same house, same day of natural causes, on February 14th, St. Valentine's Day. I attended the funeral, the double funeral, on February 16th, and my childhood friend, Edith Kermit Carew, dressed in black, her face streaming with tears, held my arm. And she said, "Theodore, if there's anything I can do for you, you let me know." I said, "Thank you, Edie, but my sister Bammy has agreed to raise my daughter as if she were her very own, and I will provide all the financial support necessary, of course, but I do appreciate your offer." After the service, I went back to the home. I went through all of my journals, any page in my journal that bore my wife's name, Alice Lee Roosevelt. I tore that page from the journal, wadded it up, and threw it in the fireplace. I likewise went around to all the portraits on the wall, tore my wife's picture from the frame, wadded them up, threw those in the fireplace. My friends thought this was very harsh of me, but I've always had the attitude that grief can be an anvil that sits upon the shoulders of the living until it crushes the life out of the survivors. There's nothing that can be done about the past. The future is the most important thing. I went back to Albany. I finished out my term as assemblyman, and then a colleague asked me if I'd like to go on a bison hunting trip to the Dakota Territories. Now, I'd been on a hunting trip in 1880 with my brother Elliot to Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, and the corner of the Dakota Territories, but I never got to explore the Dakota Territories toward the Rocky Mountains. I said, "Bully! Just the thing to take my mind off my past family tragedies." I boarded a train. I left the United States at the Minnesota border, entered the Dakota Territories, traveling through Bismarck, another 146 miles to the west, to the small village of Medora. I stepped off the train at the platform. I looked around, and I was struck with the beauty of this beautiful 360-degree panorama of prairie. A prairie that had supported the lives of 40 million bison for 10,000 years. And now the bison had been hunted to extermination by the railroads and even by the Indians. And the prairie grass that had nurtured them was growing shoulder high. And I thought to myself, what a magnificent land for a cattle ranch. I made some inquiries, and I purchased the Elkhorn Ranch on the banks of the Little Missouri River, a tributary of the Missouri River. I became a rancher. I would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, have 2 eggs, 2 biscuits, 2 slabs of bacon, 2 cups of coffee. Then I would go out into the corral, saddle up a wild bronco, put my foot in the stirrup, throw my leg across, to be thrown to the ground repeatedly. Crash, thud, whump, whop, roller, 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 roller. Each time I would get back up, retrieve my spectacles, my hat, brush myself off, put my foot back in the stirrup, throw my leg across, until by the end of the day, I was riding that wild bronco around like it was a carousel pony. It was not an uncommon thing for me to be in the saddle 23 hours straight without my feet ever touching terra firma. One time, after 17 hours in the saddle straight, chasing down some runaway horses, I happened upon the small Montana Territory village of Mingusville. Now, Mingusville had a general store, a post office, a saloon, and a hotel. There was only one building in the town, but it housed all four of those enterprises. I tied up my horse at the hitching rack. I started to make my entrance when two gunshots rang out. Bam! Bam! I thought this was very curious, but I continued with my entrance, and upon stepping inside, I was immediately confronted by a drunken, dirty cowboy with a pistol in each hand. I looked up on the wall, and the clock on the wall had 2 bullet holes in it. And upon my appearance, the man shouted out, "Look, boys, Far Eyes is going to buy the house a round of drinks." One thing I noticed immediately upon my sojourn to the West was that anyone who wore spectacles, it was somehow considered a besmirchment of their character. And many times I had to brush aside comments from my cowboys about my spectacles. This was no different. I smiled and I went and I took a seat by the pot-bellied stove. But the cowboy would not desist. He came up behind my chair, he cocked a pistol in each hand, click, click. He bent over and repeated his demand. I said Far Eyes is going to buy a house a round of drinks. He did not realize he was standing behind the runner-up boxing champion of Harvard College. I rose slowly to my feet, spun on my toes, and connected the point of his chin with a right cross. Whap! Which snapped his head 90 degrees to the left. I countered with a left cross. Whap! Which snapped his head 180 degrees to the right. He keeled over backwards, hit his head on the edge of the bar, discharged both pistols in the air, bam, bam, and fell unconscious to the floor. The fellow patrons disarmed him and drug him by his dirty cowboy boots out the front door and around back and locked him in a woodshed for the night. As I understand it, the following morning he was rearmed and he jumped aboard a freight car on a freight train headed west and was never seen in Mingusville again. The only reason that I convey this story to you is so that you will know the full truth of the matter. It never ceased to amuse me, all the distortions that were printed in the newspapers of the West. I remember one Wyoming newspaper printed, Theodore Roosevelt, that young dude from New York City, was intoxicated again in Mingusville when a passing Mormon family asked him for directions. Mr. Roosevelt, being too intoxicated to understand the question, turned to walk away when the gentleman tapped him on the shoulder and said, "What are those peculiar little windows you have perched on your nose?" At which time, Mr. Roosevelt produced a 6-shooter, bam, shot the man graveyard dead, and drug his body over onto the railroad tracks to make it look like an accident. If William Randolph Hearst would have had a reporter in the vicinity, it would have been a naked Theodore Roosevelt rode bareback on a grizzly bear into a Catholic girls' school where he ravished all of the nuns and sold all of the girls into white slavery. In 1886, personal family business required my presence back in New York City. I went to the home of my younger sister, Coney, and who should be visiting but my childhood playmate, Edith Kermit Carew. Descending the stairs in a long flowing gown, her face flushed with the blush of womanhood, looking more strikingly beautiful than any vision of a lady I'd ever seen in my life. New York City society taboos prevented a widower from dating within 3 years after his wife's demise, but we met in secret, and soon I posed the question, "Edith, will you marry me?" She said, "Theodore, I've waited all of my life for you to ask that question." Of course. We made secret arrangements to sail to Europe by different ships and meet secretly and be married in a small chapel service. She left a week before I did. I left on the day after my birthday, October 28th, 1886. I shall never forget that date because there was a big commotion in New York Harbor. It seems that people of France had given a large copper lighthouse to the people of America to commemorate our independence. And now the President of the United States, my former governor, Grover Cleveland of New York, was on hand to receive this lighthouse on behalf of the American public. And there were so many people crammed on that little Bedloe Island to see the statue unveiled that I thought the island might capsize and sink into the ocean, lighthouse and all. But because it was the day after my birthday, I've always thought that the Statue of Liberty was a personal gift to me. I sailed to England. I met up with Edith. We were married. We had a short 11-week honeymoon in Europe. We sailed back to America. And as we were sailing back, she turned to me and said, "Theodore, what do you plan to do with the rest of your life?" I said, "I am going to be a rancher." But upon arrival in New York Harbor, a telegram from my ranch foreman was waiting for me at the harbor office. It said, "Mr. Roosevelt, worst blizzard in Dakota history. Herd devastated. Request you come immediately and inspect. Sincerely, Bill Sewell, foreman." I kissed my new bride goodbye. I boarded the train, left the United States into the Dakota Territories. This time when I stepped off the train at Medora, I looked around at this 360-degree prairie landscape and saw that it was dotted with black dots, as if the land had measles or smallpox. It was dead cattle. Dead cattle so numerous a person could walk 360 degrees around the horizon by stepping from dead carcass to dead carcass. My foreman, Bill Sewell, picked me up in the rig. As we were riding back to the ranch, I said, "Bill, how bad is it?" He said, "Mr. Roosevelt, of your 4,500 head of cattle, only 80 survive. And they are dying daily." Upon arrival on the ranch, I saddled up a favorite steed. I went on a personal inspection tour. And there, on the banks of the Little Missouri River, I saw a sight that shall haunt me for the rest of my life. 15, maybe 20 feet above the ground, in the upper branches of a cottonwood tree, was a juvenile steer, emaciated and mummified. One can only imagine that it climbed up on a snowdrift to nibble at the protruding branches at the top of the tree, when its hoofs penetrated the snow, left it trapped in the upper branches until it froze to death or starved. I went back to the ranch. I signed over the deed to the ranch to my foreman for his faithful service and wished him good luck and farewell. I went back to New York City, and within 1 week, I was contacted by the Republican Party of the state of New York, asking me if I would be willing to go on the campaign trail to campaign for their presidential hopeful, General Benjamin Harrison. I said, "Why do you need me to campaign for a famous Civil War general like Benjamin Harrison, grandson of William Henry Harrison, the shortest president in American history?" He said, "Have you no idea how famous you have become from the books you've written about ranch life, about the cowboys, about the newspaper articles, about how you handled the Minkusville bully? You are the most famous man in America west of the Mississippi River." I said, "Well, I'm not sure that's accurate, but still, why do you need me?" He says, "Benjamin Harrison is a wonderful man, nice man, but he has a Midas handshake." I said, "I do not understand your meaning." He says, "With his cold, limp handshake, he can shake the hands of a lifelong Republican and turn them into a golden Democrat." Therefore, we want you with your manly ranch image to go and campaign for him west of the Mississippi River. I needed a source of income. I had taken some serious losses with my cattle. So I said, bully. I boarded a train, went west of the Mississippi. I campaigned through Minnesota, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, Texas, and General Benjamin Harrison was elected President of the United States. And as my reward, he made me Federal Civil Service Commissioner. I went to my office in Washington, D.C. I immediately started rooting out graft, greed, corruption, fraud from the ranks of the civil service. I fired the Postmaster General, and I instituted a new written examination required of all applicants who would take it on a competitive basis against all other applicants who applied for a certain job. After 6 years as Federal Civil Service Commissioner and the re-election of Grover Cleveland, who asked me to stay on, I received a telegram in the mail from the mayor of New York asking me if I'd be willing to accept the position of New York City Police Commissioner. My salary as Federal Civil Service Commissioner was $350 per month, but I had to maintain a separate home in Washington, D.C., along with a brand new home named Sagamore Hill that I just built in Oyster Bay, New York. Now, they were offering me a $400 a month salary, and I could live in my new home with my bride. I turned in my resignation, and I reported to New York City. At this time in history, I discovered that there were two notorious gangs of criminals operating in New York City. The first gang consisted of kidnappers, extortionists, thieves, murderers, and owners of houses of ill repute and houses of gambling. That gang was known as the New York City Police Department. The other gang was just common criminals who lived down by the waterfront. I fired the chief of police, most of his lieutenants. I instilled a written examination process to become a New York City policeman. I established the second police training academy in the entire United States, and I reorganized the department on the lines of a military unit. And then the Republican Party of the state of New York approached me and asked me if I'd be willing to go on the campaign trail to campaign for their presidential hopeful, Governor William McKinley of Ohio, covering the same states as before, but now then, during the Harrison administration, the new states of South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and Washington had been added. I campaigned through those new states, the old states, and William McKinley was elected, defeating that preacher politician from Nebraska, William Jennings Bryan. As my reward, he made me Assistant Secretary of the Navy. I knew more about the United States Navy than any other man in Washington, D.C. You see, my senior year at Harvard, I'd written a 2-volume treatise called The Naval War of 1812. This 2-volume book has now been required reading at the Naval Academy, West Point Military Academy, and required placement in all commissioned Navy ships. I went over my job description as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Paragraph 1 stated, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, you will assist the Secretary of the Navy in all duties assigned. Paragraph 2, in the absence of the Secretary of the Navy, you'll perform all duties of the Secretary of the Navy. I made sure that Secretary Long was absent a great deal. I lobbied Congress for more warships, better armament, better training for the men, more dry docks to repair the ships of the fleet. And then the date on the calendar wall was approaching February 12th, 1898, Abraham Lincoln's birthday. I crossed my fingers, I prayed. Nothing happened. Tore that page from the calendar. I saw that February 14th, St. Valentine's Day was approaching. That day when I lost my mother and my first wife, 13 hours apart. I crossed my fingers. I prayed. Nothing happened. I tore that page from the calendar to reveal February 15th, 1898. Western Union messenger appeared at my door with a telegram marked urgent. It seems that the battleship USS Maine had been blown up in Havana Harbor and sabotage by the Spaniards was suspected. I tendered my resignation as Secretary of the Navy and applied to the Secretary of the Army for a commission in a cavalry unit. He said, Mr. Roosevelt, the current total strength of the United States Army is only 22,000 men. I have no vacancies in any cavalry unit to put you in. I said, how would you like to have a new cavalry regiment? He said, that would be marvelous, but how would you manage that? I said, leave it to me. I put ads in all the papers west of the Mississippi River, in Iowa, Nebraska, Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, Arizona Territory, New Mexico Territory, Texas, Oklahoma Territory. Wanted brave young men who are crack shots and skilled riders to serve in a volunteer cavalry regiment underneath the leadership of Colonel Leonard Wood, Medal of Honor winner from the Indian Wars, and Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, former Secretary of the Navy and former Civil Service Commissioner and Police Commissioner of the United States, of New York State. 26,000 applications poured in. I was only allowed to select 1,500 men. I selected 1,450. I went back to the Ivy League colleges, and I handpicked 50 top leaders out of the Ivy League. I integrated them into the unit. We started training in San Antonio, Texas. The newspapers nicknamed our unit Teddy's Tarantulas. I've informed them that I did not prefer that nickname, Teddy. They changed it to Roosevelt's Rough Riders, borrowing upon Wild Bill's Wild West show and Congress of Rough Riders, Wild Bill Cody's. We trained in Texas and we got the orders to move out, but only 900 men could be transported because they had no room in the troop ships for more than that to go to Cuba. We said goodbye to 600 men. We boarded the trains, went to Tampa, boarded troop ships, and there was no room for the horses. Only the senior officers could take the horses. I informed the men, we will not be fighting as cavalry, we will be fighting as dismounted infantry. One of the Rough Riders came up to me and said, Colonel Roosevelt, I would follow you into hell if I had to do it crawling on my hands and knees. These would become prophetic words. For when we arrived on the south shore of Cuba, the situation was like this. Santiago, the Spanish capital, was on the southern shore, and my hat represents Santiago. In front of it, it had a harbor with a very narrow entrance, guarded by naval guns. The Spanish fleet was in the harbor. The American fleet was outside, waiting for them to pop out like hunters waiting at a rabbit hole. The Spanish fleet could not get out. The guns prevented the American fleets from getting in. The situation was a stalemate unless a ridgeline right behind Santiago, called San Juan Heights, could be captured by the Army. The Army was given the mission, and the Rough Riders were to attack the right flank, a place called Kettle Hill. On the day of the attack, July 1st, 1898, which was coincidentally the 35th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, where the Union and enemy forces were reversed, the commander of a regular Army unit of the 4th Infantry Division fell ill with yellow fever. Leonard Wood was promoted to Brigadier General. I was promoted to full colonel and given command of the Rough Riders. I looked the men in the eye and said, gentlemen, the just cause is on our side. Gentlemen, charge! And I, astride my horse, Little Texas, leaping over barbed wire entanglements, leaping over fighting trenches, led the Rough Riders on foot behind me to the top of Kettle Hill. Upon arrival at the top of the hill, a Spanish sniper jumped from a trench. He pointed his Mauser rifle at me. I lowered my Navy Colt double-action 38 caliber revolver. Bam! He crumpled like a jackrabbit. I dismounted from my exhausted steed. I rallied the Rough Riders. Follow me, men! We charged down a saddle and on to San Juan Heights to see the flag of surrender appear from the trenches. The war was over in 90 days. When we returned to New York City by troop ship, the commotion at the pier was tumultuous. I said, what is all the commotion? They said, you don't know? The newspaper accounts of you charging up San Juan Heights have made you the most famous man in America. When I disembarked, the New York Republican Party came up to me and said, we have an impossible task. We have a popular Democratic governor in the governor's mansion. We have no Republican candidate who could possibly defeat him. Would you be willing to run against him? I said, bully! I campaigned from east to west, from north to south in the state of New York, and I was elected governor by 17,000 votes to become the second youngest governor in the history of New York State. And then the Republican Party of New York State said, what on earth have we done? We have placed that crazy cowboy in the governor's mansion. How will we ever pry him out? Thomas Collier Platt, the leader of the Republican Party, said, there's only one thing that Teddy Roosevelt wants more than being governor of the most populated state of the United States, and that is to be president of the United States. Are you crazy, man? That would be worse yet. He says, true. But perhaps we could pry him out of the governor's mansion with an offer of the vice presidency. William McKinley's vice president, Garrett Hobart, had died some months before, and William McKinley had not selected a new candidate to run with him in the 1900 presidential race. A delegation was formed, asked me if I was willing to step up to the job. I said, gentlemen, please. I don't even know what a vice president does. Do they do anything? No, I would be useless listening to the babble of the Senate. I can be more of help to my people as the governor of the most populated state of the United States. But thank you for your flattering offer. But when I went to the Republican National Convention in Philadelphia, and it was announced that Colonel and Governor Theodore Roosevelt was going to take the podium, 15,000 delegates rose to their feet, started clapping their hands, stamping, saying, we want Teddy! We want Teddy! The chairman could not gavel them down. Order! Order! Order now! Order! For 40 minutes they kept up with their chanting. I finally took the podium. I said, thank you, thank you, thank you, down. Oh, thank you, oh, thank you, thank you, thank you, bully, bully, thank you, thank you. I appreciate that tumultuous applause, but I am here tonight to, and a man jumped from a chair and says, I nominate Theodore Roosevelt, governor of the great state of New York, to be the next president of the United States. I second the nomination, and they were on their feet again. After 10 or 20 minutes, I was able to get them back down into the seats. I said, gentlemen, you do not understand. I'm not here to run for office. I'm here to endorse the candidacy of my friend, President William McKinley. That is why a man jumped over his chair and says, I nominate Theodore Roosevelt, governor of the great state of New York, to be the next vice president of the United States. I second the nomination, and they were on their feet again, and no one could set him down. I had no choice. I accepted the nomination. President McKinley and I held our hands in a victory arch. He campaigned in the East. I campaigned in the West. And we were elected over that preacher politician, William Jennings Bryan. Then in 1901, I was vacationing with my wife, Edith, in the Adirondacks, when a ranger rode up to our campsite at a gallop. He leapt from his horse, cowboy style, and ran up to me and says, Mr. Vice President, this is for you. It's marked urgent. He said, what is it, Theodore? It says here that President McKinley was visiting the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, when a crazed gunman with a pistol wrapped in a handkerchief came up to shake his hand. The president saw the handkerchief, thought his hand was injured, and extended his left hand, at which time the gunman put the gun under his armpit and pulled the trigger twice. The president lies mortally wounded in Buffalo, and my presence is required immediately. I borrowed the ranger's horse. I rode to a livery stable, rode a rig to the nearest train depot. A special commission train took me across from eastern New York State all the way to Buffalo. In the morning when I arrived, I raised my shade in my car. I saw the streets of Buffalo had been festooned in black bunting, and the American flag was flying at half-staff. A delegation met me at the train, took me to a hotel where the president's body lay in state. I paid my regards to Mrs. McKinley. Then I was hurried away to a private residence, and without even the aid of a Bible, a judge was summoned. I raised my hand. I was sworn in as the 26th President of the United States. At age 42, the youngest president in the history of the United States. I told the widow McKinley that when she was ready for me to occupy the executive mansion, send me a telegram. That telegram came 10 days later. I moved my family onto Pennsylvania Avenue and the executive mansion. The United States Secret Service said it was the worst invasion of Washington, D.C. since the British had burned it to the ground in 1814. You see, in addition to my wife, Edith, there are my 6 children. Alice, the oldest, 17. She had a 2-foot-long green grass snake named Emily Spinach, which she kept in her purse. When she was attending a cabinet luncheon with all the other cabinet ladies, she would become bored with the conversation. She would open her purse, pull out a 2-foot-long wriggling Emily Spinach, insert Emily Spinach's head between the buttons of her waist blouse, wriggle around in her seat until Emily Spinach's head and red tongue flicked at her collar. She'd pull Emily Spinach from her collar, put her back into the purse, close the purse, then continue to listen to the conversation as if nothing had happened. She was riding with an important ambassador's wife from Europe in the outskirts of Washington, D.C., when she saw a rabbit on the side of the road. She turned to her hostess and said, "Pardon me." She opened her purse, pulled out a 6-shot revolver, bam! Now, what was it you were saying? She was seen riding around on the streets of Washington, D.C. in a red automobile at 25 miles per hour, smoking a cigarette in public. The newspapers were filled with her scandalous activities on a daily basis, sometimes front-page headlines, until finally my Secretary of State, John Hay, came to me and said, "Mr. Roosevelt, you must control Alice." I said, "Sir, I can govern the United States of America, or I can control Alice. No one could possibly do both." My other children were just as rambunctious. Theodore Jr. and Kermit would enjoy standing with the White House security police as they received their morning instructions. They would salute, turn, march away smartly at the end of the column. That afternoon, they would be on the second-story portcullis of the White House with a bushel basket full of water balloons and bombing the Secret Service as they walked by below. But in spite of these distractions, during my first 2 terms in the White House, which my wife Edith gave it that name before it was the executive mansion, we built the West Wing as an office space. We established the Department of Commerce, the Department of Labor. I settled the war between Japan and Russia, winning the Nobel Peace Prize. I settled the anthracite coal strike, which would have caused 40,000 to 50,000 Americans to freeze to death during the winter of 1901-1902. I signed into recognition the newly established Republic of Panama and negotiated a deal to cut a canal across their isthmus. I established 6 national parks, 18 national monuments, called the first in history governor's conference on conservation, imploring all of the governors to take conservation methods in their state to heart. And then I turned over the keys to the executive mansion to my Secretary of War, William Howard Taft. I campaigned for him through Iowa, Nebraska, the Midwest, and then wished him well and announced that I was going on a hunting trip to Africa. When William Randolph Hearst heard that I was going on a hunting trip to Africa, he rose to his feet at the New York City Press Club with a glass of champagne. Tink, 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 tink. Tink, tink, tink. Gentlemen, gentlemen, I understand that Teddy Roosevelt is going on safari to Africa. Here is a toast. May the lions do their duty. When I returned from Africa, I found that William Randolph Hearst had come under the thumbs of the robber barons of the Republican Party, that small 1% of the population that controlled 90% of all the commodities used by every American household and every American industry. I'd warned him against it, but he took no heed. He was not strong enough to stand up to him. So there at the Chicago Republican Presidential Convention, I threw my name in the ring to be considered to be the presidential nominee. But the robber barons had paid off all the delegates, and they said we have to go with the incumbent president, William Howard Taft. That's when I left the Republican Party. I formed my own party called the Progressive Party. That is why I'm before you this evening, to ask you for your cooperation to make those 48 stars on that American flag shine with the pride and glory of past years, to make America a beacon of opportunity, to have that Statue of Liberty greet immigrants at the harbor and know that they will be on an even playing field with every other citizen of America. Make America the foundation for freedom throughout the entire world. Make America everything that we always wanted it to be. Will you be willing to help me on this? Yeah. Now, I must return to Sagamore Hill and my home in Oyster Bay so that I may take part in this important election myself. But many times I've been asked, what is my prediction for the outcome? William Howard Taft cannot possibly win. When I left the Republican Party, 3/5 of the Republicans followed me into the Progressive Party. He does not have a base to be elected from. And Woodrow Wilson was born less than 50 miles away from the Confederate capital of Richmond right before the Civil War. There are 40 to 50,000 American Civil War veterans who would never elect a rebel to sit in the White House. Therefore, if you ask me, what would be the name of the first person in American history to spend 3 terms in the White House? I predict that name shall be Roosevelt B. Thank you. Do you have time for questions? Thank you. We have time to. Do you have any questions you'd like to ask of Theodore Roosevelt?
Well, the only one that came to mind, and is so important, is the fact that when you climbed that little mountain, what was your wife doing at the time?
She was exhausted for some reason and back at the hotel.
That's what I figured. You go ahead, honey. I'll see you when you get back.
I had 2 professional guides who went with me, and they could not keep up with me.
I can believe it.
Any other question? Yes, sir.
In the history of presidential assassinations and attempts and things like that, was this the first time that it happened in our country's history? And what kind of precedents?
Well, of course, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. This was the 3rd assassination. James Garfield was assassinated, but he lived for 4 months after his assassination attempt. And the United States Navy came up with an incredible machine to cool the room, because he was an invalid during the summer. Perhaps you've heard of this machine today. Maybe you have one in your home, air conditioner. And then of course, William McKinley, the third assassination, and then the fourth assassination was an Irishman named Kennedy.
During this election round, there was an attempted assassination on you, wasn't there?
Well, during the campaign, I was to make a speech in Milwaukee. I stepped out of my car. A man ran up to the car, put a pistol in my jacket, my overcoat, pulled the trigger. But I had a lengthy speech planned, and I had it folded in force in my pocket. The same pocket that I carry my steel spectacles case. The bullet went through my coat, through the 40-page folded in force document, through my steel spectacles case, through my vest, through my shirt, and lodged in my ribs. My entourage says I must be rushed to the hospital immediately. I said, no, I am to give a speech here, and I will give that speech. Thus, on October 14th, 1912, I stepped in front of the audience, and I said, ladies and gentlemen, I have just been shot. And the crowd burst into laughter. I said, no, you do not understand. And I opened up my vest to show my bloody shirt. I said, as I was coming here, an assassin tried to assassinate me, but it takes more than one bullet to kill a bull moose. And from then on, the Progressive Party was called the Bull Moose Party. One little detail that I left out was that during his presidency, his brother had died at age 34, a little Elliot. And so when Elliot's only daughter wanted to get married, she asked her president uncle to walk her down the aisle. So Theodore Roosevelt walked his niece, Eleanor Roosevelt, down the aisle as she married Theodore Roosevelt's fifth cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So when Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, I do, he became Theodore Roosevelt's nephew by marriage. Franklin's a nice enough young man, Harvard graduate, you know. I doubt if he'll ever amount to anything. But he came down with a terrible affliction. Yes. It's true. He became a Democrat.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, if I may speak to you as Darrell Draper, Theodore Roosevelt's good friend. I'm glad that did you enjoy the program?
Yeah.
I'm Darrell Draper from Omaha. I happen to be a 30-year military veteran. I was 14 years Army, 16 years Navy. I'm the only person that I know of in America who wore a gold leaf on their collar as an Army officer. I was a major. And later a gold leaf on my collar as a Navy officer. I was a lieutenant commander, starting at the bottom and working my way up both times. Not necessarily a career path that I'd recommend, but it was exciting for me. I'm glad to come to Iowa. My origins go back to Iowa. My great-great-grandfather was a newspaper editor in Vandalia, Iowa. And he was also a conductor on the Underground Railroad just before and during the Civil War. When the Missouri slave owners found out he was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, they put a dead or alive bounty on his head. He decided that he had seen most of Iowa, and now it's time to move to Nebraska. So I'm a fifth-generation Nebraska boy now. But my wife is a board-certified Iowegian. She grew up in Cedar Rapids. In fact, her mother was county supervisor for Lynn County for 24 years. Her name was Jean Oxley. She was a leader in the Democratic Party here in Iowa. She's still alive, coming up on her 89th birthday in November. And my wife is very proud of her Iowa heritage. She's a Cyclone, and she's established a scholarship at the University of Iowa. So I have double roots back to Iowa. Yes.
My sister and I are seventh cousins, 3 times removed.
Seventh cousin, 3 times removed. Does everybody understand what a first cousin once removed is?
No.
All right. If your grandfather and my grandfather is the same person,
Right.
we are first cousins.
Yes, that's right.
Your daughter is my first cousin once removed. So, different generation. So removed, twice removed would be your grandchild, 3 times removed your great-grandchild.
And so on and so on and so on.
Yeah. Theodore Roosevelt's oldest son, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., he was an Army officer in World War I. He saw how much fun that his father had attending the Rough Rider reunions, usually held in New Mexico. So he started a little organization. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called the American Legion, founded by Theodore Roosevelt Jr. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. won the Medal of Honor for his actions as a brigadier general on the beaches of Utah Beach during the invasion of Normandy. And Theodore Roosevelt, the president, he was put in for a Medal of Honor following his San Juan Heights attack, but he had made enemies in the Secretary of the Army's, Department of the Army's office, and they did an in-basket veto of his nomination. So Tweed Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, the president's great-grandson, appealed to Bill Clinton, as Bill Clinton was leaving office, to look into the matter and see if the write-up deserved a Medal of Honor. The last month of Clinton's office, the Department of Defense determined that his actions had earned the Medal of Honor, and so Theodore Roosevelt got the Medal of Honor much posthumously in the year 2000. Only father and son Medal of Honor winners in the history of the United States, except for Douglas MacArthur and Arthur MacArthur, his father. Any other questions?
Are there any direct descendants still living?
Oh yes, they're one of it is named is that Theodore Roosevelt IV was involved in that, was a spokesperson for the bank that went under during when all the banks were in trouble and too big to fail. He resigned from the firm 1 month before their name hit the front page of the newspaper. I have one little short. Oh yes, another question there.
Wasn't Alice married in the White House?
Alice married Congressman Nicholas Longworth. She was married in the White House the year following Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt and Alice Roosevelt were first cousins, could not be in the same room together. Eleanor Roosevelt became a Democrat. Alice Roosevelt became a progressive when her father was a progressive and later a Republican. And there was bad blood between Eleanor and Alice. If there was a family gathering and one found out the other one was going to be there, the other one didn't show. But Alice lived to be 96 years old. She had all of her wits about her. She was the social queen of Washington, D.C. for most of her life. She was married when she was like 20. And for the next 80 years, she was the social queen of Washington, D.C. And she was famous for a needlepoint cushion that she had on the couch in her parlor that said, "If you don't have anything good to say about someone, sit next to me."
That's not a Bambi line, is it?
Now, I have a little encore presentation here.
Slow down just a minute.
Alice Roosevelt was that daughter that was born on February 12th, 1884.
She was the social queen of New York.
No, of Washington, D.C. I said 80 years. 60 years. 60 years. That mathematics thing, I never quite get my...
Still can't get it
I have a book of poetry, but I have to ask a question first. Young lady, what's your name there? That beautiful young lady there? What's your name? Taylor? I have a granddaughter named Taylor. Taylor, the house that you live in, do you have running water in your house? Like you turn on a tap and water comes out?
Yeah.
You turn on a tap? Yeah. Yeah. I grew up in a farmhouse in Nebraska, and we had running water. We had 2 buckets on the kitchen counter, and I would grab those buckets and run out to the cast iron pump in the front yard, pump them full of water, run them back in, and then we put an aluminum dipper in one of the buckets that everybody drank out of. Never saw anybody ever wash that dipper. They figured, how could it possibly get dirty? It's underwater all the time. So everybody in my family shared everything. Well, Taylor, if you don't have running water, there's also a room that you probably don't have that you wouldn't have in your house. You probably have a place where you go brush your teeth and powder your nose. We didn't have such a room because we didn't have running water. So our sanitary needs were met by a little wooden shed 20 yards behind the house. And if you went out to it was easy to find the shed because there was a groove worn in the sod that deep. So even on a pitch black, moonless night, you could feel with your toes exactly where that path was. And you go out there to that shed, and you open the door of the shed, and just inside there was a little shelf. And on that shelf was a Sears and Roebuck catalog. And on top of the Sears and Roebuck catalog, there was a roll of toilet paper. But sometimes you'd go out there, and you'd sit down, and you'd look up, and there's just a cardboard tube. That gave you permission to sort through the Sears and Roebuck catalog, find the least interesting pictures. It seems like the ladies' lingerie ads lasted the longest. And use those for toilet paper. But if there's nothing left but ladies' lingerie ads, there was an emergency bucket over in the corner filled with red and white corn cobs, with a theory that you used a red corn cob, then you used a white corn cob to see if you needed to use yet another red corn cob.
You don't have that quite right. The Montgomery Ward catalog, the yellow pages were a lot softer.
Yeah, the index pages. Yes, the index pages. Yes. The first poem in the book describes growing up in that house. It's called My Mother's Uplifting Love. With your permission, I'll perform that for you. Growing up on a farm near a small Nebraska town has shaped my life for the larger part and made me somewhat a clown because farm folks do things different than their city counterparts. Different thoughts, different ways, and different loving hearts. My mother, Ruby, was different too, from the back hills of Virginia, a strong-willed woman, tried and true, that you could ever have befriend you. But she had some different ways that she had learned in the Blue Ridge Mountains, ways to make do and ways to fix too. Of this knowledge, she was a fountain. She always wanted to worry about environmental matters, or herbicides, or pesticides, or petroleum spills and spatters. Take the time when she cleaned Pa's jeans when the Tide and Clorox failed. She filled a pan with some gasoline, and those grease spots came unrailed. But what could she do with this explosive brew? Her mind went in a tizzy. Might kill the grass, or poison the cat, or make the chickens dizzy. Too volatile for the heating stove, too dirty to run the Chevy. Where, oh, where could this stuff be thrown? Then her eyes fixed on our privy. Our little house behind the house with seats at number 3, one for Pa, one for Ma, and a tiny one for me. So off she goed with her explosive load, and she raised the center seat lid, and she poured the liquid contents whole into this place, forever hid. On the next day's morning, when Pa rose from last night's hearty meal, he sniffed the air, and he knew right there, it's last night's beans I feel. So with his bib overalls half on, he left for the John to sit on the right-hand seat. And he fished a cool from out of his pack to smoke his morning treat. With confidence, he struck that match. And the blaze set that cool aglow. Then he moved his hand toward that center seat, the burning match to throw. Mommy, come here, yelled my voice in fear, and terror gripped my heart from that thunderous kaboom that blew our outhouse apart. Also shook me from my bed and gave me instant shivers. And upon the roof above my head, you could hear the raining slivers. Out back we dashed with our jammies on. My two brothers dashed out later, and we viewed with awe of what we saw of that smoking 12-foot crater. My mother's mind began to rewind to her deed of yesterday, but the silence was broke when my brother spoke. Has anyone seen Pa today? We looked around without a sound as we wondered where Pa might be. To the devil's door, or to heaven he'd soar, wearing his winter BVDs. Then my brother Jay stepped forward to say, or rather point to a nearby tree, and there hung Pa by a single strap of his sturdy Big Smith bib. Around his neck, the outhouse seat. Behind his head, the lid. That blast of flame kind of made him tame, and he was humming Rock of Ages, while all around there was fluttering down, still smoking Sears Roebuck pages. He couldn't hear with his blast-deafened ears or know what state he was in. It was all he could do to think the catastrophe was through and to never eat baked beans again. Thank you very much.